and welcome to PCI DSS 4.0.1, March 31st deadline, Essential Steps for Fuel Retailers. I'm your host, Casey Brandt, a standards coordinator for Conexxus, and your moderator for today will be Phil Stead, Vice President of Sales, Edge Platform for Acumera, and Chair of the Conexxus Data Security Committee. So for our agenda for today, I'll go through a little bit of housekeeping, give you some information about Conexxus, and then Phil will introduce our presenters. They'll give the presentation, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So a little bit of the housekeeping, a replay of this session will be made available on Conexxus365.org. Make sure you send your questions into the Zoom interface as soon as you can. The sooner you get them in, hopefully we'll be able to answer it sooner towards the end. PCI credits are available for qualifying events, so please contact us if you're interested in that. Go to the next one. And just a disclaimer we have to put in here, this is views and opinions are solely of the speakers and not of Conexxus itself. So now I'm going to do a huge shout out to our 2025 annual sponsors at Conexxus. The extra support is really appreciated and allows us to continue the work that we do on behalf of the industry. So a little bit about Conexxus. Conexxus is a not-profit technology organization. Our members really do the heavy lifting here. So we provide a neutral forum where retailers and vendors can network and come together to create standards and solutions that are beneficial to our industry. We educate through white papers and webinars like this one at Conexxus365, and we advocate on a technical level at other organizations to help steer the conversations around standards and policies so that changes don't negatively affect your business. So a little about Conexxus365. We're an educational webinar series that has monthly webinars. Make sure you're subscribed to our email list and that you can check the website to be notified of future webinars. The next couple webinars will be looking at some information about EBT chip cards and recent data privacy legislation updates. Make sure you follow us on LinkedIn and you can look for us at conexxus.org. And now I'll turn it over to Phil. Go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Casey. Welcome, everybody, to today's webinar titled PCI DSS 4.0.1, March 31st deadline, Essential Steps for Fuel Retailers. I'm Phil Stead. I'm the VP of Sales for Acumera and Chair of the DSC, the Data Security Committee at Conexxus. Today, I'm joined by Omega ATC, a PCI validated level 1 service provider, actively working in C-store and fuel retail today, helping retailers move towards the 4.0.1 standard. So I've got our panelists here, Ashwin and Greg. Guys, go ahead and give yourselves a little intro.
Hello, hello. Like Phil mentioned, I'm Ash Swami, the CEO of Omega ATC. We deal directly with a lot of these cybersecurity and PCI compliance requirements of fuel retailers nationwide, normally everything behind the firewall. And so we've spoken to hundreds of merchants over this past year. And there's no doubt that PCI is top of mind now as this March 31st deadline draws near. A lot of merchants are up against the clock. So if you're on this call and you're still scrambling, I can tell you you're not alone, and hopefully we can help you here today.
Greg, want to just give a quick intro?
Sure. Hi, my name is Greg DeClue with Omega ATC, Cyber Operations Manager. Well, I work very much hand-in-hand, forward-facing with customers, working through these various requirements, helping provide solutions and consulting with the different requirements for the PCI DSS.
Fantastic. Well, guys, I'm thrilled to be here today. This is right off the heels of the Conexxus annual convention, which we were attending, Ashwin and Casey, several weeks ago in Tucson, which was a great event. And I implore everybody that's on this webinar to please get involved with Conexxus. There's great value in these conversations around standards and how these standards are both developed and adopted. It's a great event, really high value content and moderation there. Ashwin, we got a chance to speak about, in general, around PCI and around the kind of data security standard and some of the life cycle and timelines on how it's somewhat I think to some people it's a little bit of a mystery as to how these requirements kind of get surfaced up as hard requirements. So I was wondering maybe you could kind of talk about what the future data requirements, what that timeline cycle looks like, and how these things become kind of statement of law for fuel retail.
Sure, absolutely. I would first also echo that it was an awesome Conexxus annual conference and was a great opportunity for a lot of information sharing. As far as PCI, I mean, PCI is set by the payment card industry and the major card brands, and enforced by the PCI SSC. And so many of you in the audience are probably aware that PCI version 4.0, which is very similar to the current 4.0.1 version, took effect last March 2024 and replaced the previous 3.2.1 standard from 2018. And actually, the overall 3.0 standard was initiated, I believe, in 2013. So entering this version 4.0 is a major shift. These security standards, like it says on this slide, are meant to stay in line with today's cyber threat landscape and make sure that they're meeting the realities of today's retail environment. For many retailers, that has been undergoing rapid digital transformation. So as part of this 4.0.1 update, and we'll go into this further later on, merchants are asked to perform a qualitative targeted risk analysis of their own card data environment. And then based on this risk analysis, they then have the opportunity to determine the frequency in which certain activities like vulnerability scanning or patching need to be performed, and they're able to justify the terms of the review. So there's 52 new requirements. This does apply to all merchant levels. And something else to kind of add, something that we won't get into today, but version 4.0.1 allows merchants to implement customized controls that don't necessarily follow the letter of the requirement, but they still meet the overall security objective. So, like it says on this slide, greater flexibility was a priority. As far as the timeline, of these 64 or so new requirements that came into effect for PCI 4.0 last year, so right around here, this Q1 2024, 52 of them are called future dated requirements. So that's being called out over here. And they came with an extended timeline to ensure that there would be sufficient time for merchants to upgrade. But as some of the folks on this call are aware, updating the fuel retail environment is a heck of a lot different than most retail environments. And so many convenience retailers that we've been speaking to are scrambling and find themselves up against the clock.
Yeah. Yeah, and for sure. So today we're very focused today. Obviously, this is a convenience and fuel retailer based webinar, but anybody who's following kind of the future data requirements and the timeline and has been on LinkedIn at all, there's been a ton of noise around some of the modifications around the SAQA self-assessment questionnaire. It's really interesting, some of the takebacks on this. Now, likely there's nobody on this call that's filling out an SAQA, right? Because that's really restricted down to, e-com merchants that are doing card not present, that have fully outsourced, payment processing and parts of the payment architecture, to third parties or mail order transaction type environments. But what's really interesting here, and some of the headlines on LinkedIn were great, like the PCI debacle of 2025 or the SAQA hullabaloo. Some fantastic taglines have been thrown out there, but really it's interesting that they've eliminated in the SAQA 6.4.3, which is really kind of like a FIM requirement, Ashwin, around like inventorying the actual code and the actual scripts that are used for payment redirection, right? To authenticate the integrity of those. And then they've also taken out 11.6.1, which is actually the technical security control. So while those are e-com, but this plays because in the C-store space, as we heard 2 weeks ago, every large and every C-store operator or merchant is expanding into digital channels, order ahead, buy online, pick up in store, all of those types of things that extend that payment architecture out. How should people interpret this, and what does that mean in terms of this guidance as it applies to the C-store retailer that's adding additional channels? What's the take on this?
I mean, I think you nailed it. Even though the SAQA does not apply to convenience retailers, it's strictly e-commerce merchants. That requirement 11.6.1 specifically focuses on the security of e-commerce payments and e-commerce skimming attacks. So PCI is making it clear that digital payment channels and card not present transactions are also part of the merchant scope, and that will be assessed as well, and it needs to be secured.
Got it. So Greg, point this one to you. So obviously, cyber attacks are changing. The attack surface has vastly changed over the last several years. PCI 4.0, certainly opens that up, and the language is specific. So what are you guys seeing over at Omega in terms of, the overall investment around security tooling and investment in cybersecurity in general? How is that playing out in terms of adoption of security controls and the like?
Yeah, so operators are seeing that no matter what their size, they need to be aware of cyber threats and they need to have the same security posture. Convenience stores and gas stations, no matter whether they are a single operator or a large chain, they're critical infrastructure. They need to stay up 24/7 to support their community. It's no longer just a big guys have to worry kind of scenario. So the attacks are getting much more sophisticated. With the use of AI, deep fakes, they're able to mimic requests from internal operators, trusted third parties, like mimicking a C-suite employee type environment. So security now needs to be thought of as a cost of doing business. It needs to be included in your operating budget just as much as your insurance or your payroll. In terms of ROI, cybersecurity and PCI compliance as a whole helps to secure retailers' investment in digital transformation projects. Meeting the PCI DSS 4.0.1 compliance requirements, they can help reduce breach costs, potentially affect your cybersecurity premiums, and even make franchise expansion or even acquisitions much more seamless.
Got it. Got it. Good points. So I think in general, and I think Ashwin, we certainly see this when we're at Conexxus events, the largest operators in the space, they make decisions around vendors where traditionally in C-store, it's kind of been like the single vendor vessel, right? You bought hardware, software, and managed services from one or two players in the space. That landscape has been kind of broken apart. And now what we're seeing is the major vendors in this space are delivering their solutions in a modular way. And what that translates to is you've got multiple vendors, right? You may have a different point of sale vendor than your fuel controller, than your EPS, and you start bringing in online delivery and third party and all of the other kind of modern application architecture things together, it gets complicated. So, and that's for the top level. For the smaller merchants, it's a similar challenge. How do you get these parties to align? Like, what's the mechanism? Like, how do you bring in a multi-vendor environment with different MNSPs? Like, what's the strategy there from your perspective?
I mean, really, you got to get everybody involved. All the members in the retail technology environment have to play their part in getting these services up to date, and they need to be quick about it. I mean, we've got a March 31st deadline and beyond that we've got to attain. Whether it's your service contractors making changes to your POS systems, adding those service accounts for your vulnerability scanning, your MNSPs updating their network requirements, management making new policies and implementing new procedures, your third-party service providers acknowledging their contractual roles and responsibilities to meet PCI requirements, all the way to the frontline workers receiving that cyber awareness training. Everyone's got to play a part, but it's the retailer's responsibility to bring this alignment in a multi-vendor environment altogether. But with a phased, organized approach, it's achievable.
Totally agreed. So, like Greg, like you just mentioned, upgrading the PCI 4.0.1 doesn't have to be a nightmare if you follow a logical sequence of first defining your scope, and that's the scope of your environment and also the scope of your PCI responsibilities, then implementing security controls and making sure that your third parties are doing the same. And then lastly, defining policies and procedures for things like security awareness training, incident response, and documenting your overall information security policy governance. So kind of, jumping into it here, defining your scope, something that we advise merchants at Omega before diving into the minutia of compliance requirements and network diagrams and roles and responsibilities. It's best to get a clearer view of your organization at a 10,000-foot level. So if you take a look at just this basic grid here, you're going to want to map out all of your store formats using a grid just like this, especially if you're a larger retailer or you're a franchisee with different types of store concepts. If you have different food service formats or different sites with different MNSPs or different fuel brands, Make sure you lay out a clear profile of your overall retail enterprise. And then one by one for each retail configuration, you can then navigate through which third parties you'll need to engage with, where the obvious security gaps might exist, and then where the scope of responsibility might lie. Then you get into defining, your overall PCI scope. Now, PCI throughout requirement 12 and especially 12.5, they're very clear about how to define the PCI scope, which isn't just the card data environment, meaning where transactions are processed, stored, and transmitted, and so on. But they're also focused on the connections to the card data environment that can potentially compromise the security of the CDE. So this slide has the exact requirement language, and we've highlighted some of the things that they're calling out here. So, connections from third-party entities includes remote environments, potentially VPN cloud environments. And each of these types of connected to environments, especially those managed by third-party service providers, they need to meet the PCI controls, which Greg will discuss later. And also, as part of defining scope, it's absolutely worthwhile to put together an up-to-date inventory of all assets. I mean, a lot of this is just about your regular IT hygiene. So some of this information might be able to be pulled from your managed network service provider platform, getting device lists and things like that, or network monitoring you might have in place, or RMM agents, unified endpoint management agents that you might be using to manage systems in your environment. So I think everyone should keep in mind that devices that are not properly identified in your inventory are likely not being properly managed, and therefore they're not being properly secured, and therefore they become a backdoor into your environment and a source of compromise. Go ahead, Phil.
No, I was just going to say, I was just going to say, I think scoping, I was going to pose this to Greg. I think scoping of the CDE is such a critical exercise, and it's so important and misunderstood. I think that, it's easy to get caught into. I agree with you, Ashwin. I think, it's not just about systems that store, process, transmit cardholder data. There's complexity there for sure. It's often thought of, more of an engineering, payments exercise. And that's what PCI is. At the end of the day, PCI is about protecting cardholder data, right? The web application firewall, perimeter security is all, around ultimately, really protecting that nucleus of payment card data. But the thing that's interesting is where in the C-store space especially, there's such a high proliferation of MNSP activity and third-party vendors, especially when you get out to the masses, right? The smaller operators, they're relying on third-party service providers to deliver a service, and that service has to be attested to. So Greg, what's the approach with third-party service providers across all of this, right? Whether they're in fuel or EPS or point of sale, if they're part of that connected CDE, how do you guarantee or measure the third-party vendor alignment in this approach?
Yeah, so I mean, really, the R&R document should be your security roadmap. It identifies who owns the various requirements, and in the PCI DSS 4.0.1, every one of the 12 requirements also features a specific requirement that says roles and responsibilities are documented, assigned, and understood. So this should be defined for every PCI requirement with every vendor. In addition to having that roles and responsibilities defined for each vendor, you also need to get a document and any kind of incident or breach modification procedure and response playbook that each has. One of the biggest risk areas for the fuel environment specifically is through compromise of third-party service provider, the supply chain incidents. Some of you might remember the SolarWinds breach or the CrowdStrike incident that crippled systems in the industry. So if a vendor doesn't have the PCS 4.0.1 AOC, they still should be able to certify they are compliant with specific PCI controls, whether that's anti-malware, user access, incident response, and they should be able to document in the roles and responsibilities. In this example roles and responsibilities documents, where it says shared, it often means that the vendor only has responsibility for those systems they are contractually managed or control in the CDE. Other systems are the merchant or other third-party service responsibility. In addition to the roles and responsibilities, it's also recommended that a RACI matrix is suggested for internal stakeholder responsibility, which might include technical staff and management. So along with defining your roles and responsibilities with the service providers, it's critical that you ensure that third-party access to systems is also secured. Starting on March 31st, all access to the CD must have multi-factor authentication, as described in 8.42 and 8.51. It's two unique factors of authentication that are enforced. In addition, we highly recommend updating and implementing a comprehensive user management policy. It needs to include defining roles by business unit. A regular cadence of 90 days or less for verifying users and removing inactive users. For those third-party providers that have their own users on the system, if they manage the POS for you or some other environment, they must also enforce and take responsibility for these requirements. Microsoft cited this year alone that 99.9% of all compromised accounts don't have MFA, and that 99% of identified attacks per day are password-based. So given today's threat landscape, the PCI Council has made increasing password length and complexity a priority, right? So shown in requirement 4.36, all systems in the CD must meet these new requirements for passwords of 12 characters, as well as alphanumeric characters or better, right? So even if they're a merchant and they don't have to control your POS environment, please make sure that your POS environment controlling authorized service contractors updates these configurations to the new requirements.
Absolutely right, Greg. I think as we move forward, I don't know, Phil, if you had wanted to jump in there.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. Like I'm not trying to date myself here, but how old is PCI now? What is it? 2003. I'm sure we've got some of the people that were part of that first QSA class on this call today. But
Right.
PCI is a mature standard, right? At this point, it's a self-regulated standard initiated by the card brands, based on all the massive data breaches that were happening in the late 90s, early 2000s, with all those, before there was really any sort of thought around how to protect cardholder data, right? And predating validated P2PE and all that stuff. So the concept of defense in depth has always been kind of part of PCI. It's always been, hey, you've got to have a firewall, right? Well, you've got to have, and PCI doesn't tell you the vendors to use, but it gives you a baseline of requirement around, hey, you've got to protect the perimeter. You've got to have file integrity monitoring. You've got to have like rogue access point detection. You got to have logging, all these layered defenses. But the threat landscape, Ash, when we were talking about it at Conexxus, it's changed so dramatically. Like it's so sophisticated. The attacks are so sophisticated. So how do you recommend like retailers look at that next level of investment? Like what's the right approach on the implementation of security controls, considering like every time we open up the news, it's like there's some massive data breach. Like what's the low-hanging fruit? What's the right approach to look at from a security control perspective?
Well, I think you nailed it. And maybe just a quick point off the cuff here about defense in depth. I think that term was originally coined in the CIS controls, but the idea is that you're not necessarily going to stop every single intrusion or every single attack, but can you raise that cost of intrusion to a breaking point with each additional security layer that it doesn't make it worth it for the hacker to try to go after your environment? They're going to go after an easier target elsewhere. And so that defense in depth is in many ways defined in the PCI controls. And I think the updated standard does a good job of mandating that. So, we'll talk a little bit about the targeted risk analysis in a second, but like you're saying, in terms of the different defense layers, you have your firewall perimeter, and that includes these days things like your wireless intrusion detection, wireless intrusion prevention, where you are making sure that devices cannot connect to rogue access points and things like that. Like Greg mentioned earlier, MFA is a huge part of things that prevent a lot of password-based attacks. Then on the endpoints, in terms of protecting systems from malicious software, you have your EDR, which we'll get into in a little bit more depth in a moment here. You have your file integrity monitoring. You have the need to collect certain event logs that can help you identify compromises. And under that continuous monitoring point here, PCI version 4.0.1 is saying that you need to centralize all of your logging, not just from all the devices, but also from your different point security tools. And then Greg is going to talk about some proactive measures like authenticated vulnerability scanning, where you proactively go out and scan your networks and applications for known weaknesses that can be proactively patched and remediated. So, excuse me. So as far as that targeted risk analysis. This is something that you're going to hear a lot about if you haven't already. When it comes to version 4.0.1, each merchant must perform a targeted risk analysis of the cardholder data environment. This takes the place of the previous, standards risk assessment that was previously mandated by PCI, and it's meant to help merchants define for themselves the risks in their environment and how to best protect against them, and the frequency with which certain activities need to be performed. So, there's a lot of guidance documents. If you just search, like this one right here, Targeted Risk Analysis, PCI, it's a very straightforward set of guidance documents that actually show you how to walk through the PCI TRA. And like I said before, the purpose of doing this is ultimately to see if you can save yourself some pain down the road and make it more manageable to meet some of these security controls. And in these guidance documents, like you see here, they actually suggest what frequency, that certain activities need to be performed. So I'll call something out here. So let's just say 9.5.1.2.1. The frequency of periodic point of interaction device inspections and the type of inspections performed is defined in the entity's targeted risk analysis. Well, there are pumps out there that basically make it impossible to implement a skimmer. And if a hacker was going to try to implement a Bluetooth skimmer and they needed to open the pump up, some of those pumps are designed that the entire pump operation shuts down. So there's no way that a store manager wouldn't know about it. So in that example, where something is significantly tamper-proof, maybe the frequency of that point of interaction device inspection doesn't have to happen every week. Maybe it's every month, or maybe it's every few months. So that's just one example. But for each of these, based on your specific environment as a merchant, there's an opportunity to define that activity frequency and flexibility. So like you mentioned, Phil, endpoint security. There's some nuance here. I mean, some merchants do not have any control over their point of sale environment. They can add users and access a few, web consoles via HTTPS, but they're not able to make changes to the system. But other point of sale environments may be fully open. Maybe they're fully Windows based, and maybe the merchant is managing it completely. But one way or the other, these activities have to be performed on that endpoint. And PCI specifies that all system components in the CDE, in particular those with an operating system, have to have the anti-malware controls in place. And so, it's not just having an anti-malware solution that has continuous behavioral analysis, which typically refers to an EDR solution, but they want to make sure that this anti-malware solution has specific settings in place to meet the PCI requirement, like removable media scanning. If you insert a USB drive, that should be immediately flagged or blocked. File integrity monitoring is not a very straightforward thing to implement at all times, because you may be specifying certain files or folders and directories that should not have any files that change because they're critical to the operating system. But with thousands of changes happening on that endpoint, how do you deal with that? So a lot of tools today do have some level of machine learning and trend analysis. And so these are things that when you think about updating your systems, that have to be discussed internally or with your service provider. And then a big thing here is continuous monitoring. Long story short, PCI is asking that merchants have 24/7 security operations in place, and that all log data from all security tools, firewalls, endpoints are centrally collected and monitored. So you can see right on the PCI guidance here on the right, it specifically calls out technologies like security information and event management tools that can process these events. So all of this has to be configured either by the merchant IT staff, third-party service providers, or authorized service contractors.
Yeah, so I think what's really helpful is I think the clarification in language that PCI, that the Payment Card Industry Security Council, I think that's helpful because I think there's a lot of ambiguity and discretion as to how audits are done. I think that's really helpful. Hey, Greg, as it relates to authenticated scans, so in PCI 4.0.1, right, there's a modification for authenticated vulnerability scanning. What does that mean in terms of both the approach, the technical requirement, what the operators and fuel retailers now have to consider when they're now measuring, their ASVs, or let's talk about scanning in general. Authenticated scans. What's the uplift from 3.2.1 to 4.0.1?
Yeah, so the main difference between 3.2.1 and 4.0.1 is that requirement to do credentialed scanning, right? So the purpose behind that authenticated scan is to provide a more in-depth look at systems security vulnerabilities by using credentials that allow access to the internal components and the configurations of it. Now, an authenticated scan will require credentials to be listed in the scanning platform. You want to make sure that you're using complex password settings, 20 characters alphanumeric, and as well as having that same service account then set up on all the systems the scanners will have access to. That's a big one. So the authenticated scan allows the scanner to help identify weaknesses at an application level that would not be visible without these credentials. So the ultimately allows for a more accurate picture of potential vulnerabilities on your given networks and systems. Now, keep in mind, a vulnerability is a known weakness in an application or particular configuration through security research, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it poses a risk to your particular environment or has been actively exploited. So for this reason, PCI has added a new requirement to version 4.01, requirement 6.3.1, which makes a distinction between vulnerability rating and the risk, the merchant CDE, that the vulnerability can be truly leveraged to compromise that environment. Another key update to 4.0.1 is that the merchants need to put in place a plan to remediate all vulnerabilities. It's not just the old way of thinking where, all you have to worry about is the criticals and the highs. You can mitigate this to some extent by doing a thorough targeted risk analysis ahead of time to help determine what really is your high risks to your environment. And then you have to determine the time frame to remediate. The high risks need to be remediated within 30 days. Low risks, generally a reasonable time frame is 180 days. So, depending on the type of operating system in the CDE, the number of vulnerabilities can be significantly greater with authenticated scanning compared to today's non-authenticated scans. But many of the vulnerabilities that will be found are often the responsibility of the third-party provider, your POS vendor, maybe your MNSPs, to remediate. So, making sure you have a dependable support contact to send these vulnerability information to work with them. So, a lot of these service providers may already or should already be scanning their own environments and may already be aware of these vulnerabilities and have the remediation plans in place, whether that's through patching, firmware updates, other security controls put in place to help mitigate while they're working on the patches. And lastly, the authenticated vulnerability scan reports can seem overwhelming. Simply organizing the data differently can make things much more manageable. I mean, more often than not, you're probably going to see the majority of vulnerabilities that appear from a scan all the same vulnerability across all your entire environment in different locations in different systems. But if you sort that vulnerability data by frequency rather than simply by location, you can help provide a clearer picture of your environment and how to address those.
Got it. So kind of looking at the kind of three major pillars of, working through these compliance objectives, Ashwin, we talked about this at when we were on site in Tucson. There's PCI has a pretty heavy lift in terms of documentation, right? Traditionally, like the kind of information security policy and guidance and standards and things that organizations have traditionally done. But what do you recommend for, the wider audience in terms of, how do you make this stuff actionable? How do you make documentation useful and operational and actionable for the smaller C-store fuel retailer chain? And where is the value center in that? Like, what do you recommend in terms of getting policies and procedures, positioned in a way that they're enabling, security?
Sure. So like you said, I mean, in every requirement, all 12 requirements for PCI 4.0.1, each of them actually begins first with a requirement that asks merchants to have an information security policy that governs that specific requirement and documents how that requirement is being met. So that might be your X.1.1. And then the next requirement in every single overall control asks that roles and responsibilities are defined. So both externally, but also internally. So they talk about a RACI matrix, responsible, accountable, consultant, informed. Long story short, for every responsibility, for every requirement, you need to document who's responsible internally and who's responsible externally. But in terms of overall information security policy and policies and procedures, I would say the two biggest areas are security awareness training and that incident response planning piece. So security awareness training 12.6.1, but actually some other requirements touch on that. And then the incident response planning 12.10.1. This version 4.0.1 PCI guidance goes into considerable depth around incident response planning. So let's just start with security awareness training. Like Greg mentioned earlier, we are in a new threat landscape, period. So there's been a 40% increase in AI-based attacks in 2025 so far, and that number will only continue to increase. So things like using deep fakes for social engineering or even compromising capture forms is becoming more and more common. But I think something in terms of making it actionable, Phil, security awareness training is not just about training corporate employees. I have seen that pattern where a lot of the security awareness training is being done by your corporate staff, your IT staff, but to make this effective, it has to go all the way to the frontline employees. They have a huge role to play. So whether, this requirement up here in 9.5.1, like I mentioned earlier, checking those point of interaction devices for skimmers, frontline employees have to make sure that that's being done. Along with that, some of this, if you think about these deep fake attacks, having awareness when you're getting a phone call, you're getting a text message, really thinking twice about, whether it makes sense that message is being sent to you. Who is it coming from? Obviously, what links are you clicking on in an email? Because at the end of the day, human error is still the #1 source of compromise in these environments.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, I think that's the security awareness training piece of it. I don't know if that hit your question there.
Yeah, the other thing you brought up is, which I think is, for the largest organizations, they've got IT governance, they've got, they've got a better control around their vendors for an IRP, right? For an incident response plan. But I think it's important. Can you talk about an IRP, because for the smaller operators, what's the purpose and intent? Is it really kind of like a ripcord? Like if something substantial happens, like PCI is very focused around protection of cardholder data, right? The IRP is really based on that action. So how do you gather who should be included in an IRP, both from a content perspective and from an actionable exercise?
Sure. So, there's your internal stakeholders, and then there's your external stakeholders. Internal stakeholders can be your IT staff, your executives, your management. Obviously, there's a range of incidents that can exist, anywhere from outages to full data breaches and things of that nature. So, depending on the size of your firm, of your operation, we do generally recommend having some kind of IR firm on retainer, or at least building that relationship ahead of time. And a big piece of this, I'll just walk through the steps. First, read the requirement, 12.10. There's a whole bunch of sections. Engage your internal stakeholders, and I'll touch on the third-party service providers in a second. But what we strongly recommend is you need to have an incident response playbook in place. So for every type of attack, for every type of environment, what is your playbook? Because you don't have the opportunity to think about what steps to take in the moment of crisis, right? So if it's a malware event, if it's a data breach, if it's a ransomware, if it's a DDoS attack, if it's a major outage, Greg mentioned earlier incidents that people on this call might be aware, whether it's Colonial Pipeline or the SolarWinds breach or the CrowdStrike incident that brought down a lot of systems. One thing I would recommend, and you mentioned that larger operations might already have relationships with their vendors and incident response plans, but candidly, I would say it's still not sufficient at all, because do you know the right contact at your point of sale system vendor? Do you know the right contact, with your MNSP, and so on and so forth? And if an incident happens, are they able to procure the data you need to identify the source of compromise in a timely fashion? So just like you have your fire drills and any number of other drills, organizations large and small need to be thinking about incident response planning ahead of time. reach out to us after this. I mean, we have some pretty straightforward templates that even a smaller operator can think through. And even just going through that exercise mentally once or twice, or doing it with the team and having these regular tabletops, it goes a long way. And I would just add that the longer it takes to identify the source of a compromise and contain it, the more it's going to cost your organization. So the smaller you make that incident response timeline, the more money you save. There's ROI there. And so this is definitely an important piece of it. And like you said, I mean, every single PCI requirement, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whether it's 1.1, 10.1, 11.1.1, it starts with making sure that security policies and procedures are identified and kept up to date. And I think that's useful not just for making sure, that you're able to explain to your own staff if you're an IT leader, but also to your board, how are you handling overall cybersecurity and PCI compliance? But if there's ever staff turnover and things like that, they need to be able to survive beyond whoever might have been in charge at a particular point in time. So I would say that overall, those are kind of the three big things when it comes to implementing policies and procedures.
Got it. Great. So guys, we've covered a ton of ground here in the move to the future dated requirements for PCI 4.0.1. If you guys were to boil this down, Ashwin, back to kind of some takeaways, some core things that people can take away from this as compliance is shifting, maybe you can just walk through that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Greg, if I'm missing anything, feel free to jump in here. But we talked about three phases. The first phase is defining your scope, the scope of your card data environment, the scope of your third-party connections, and also the scope of your responsibility. The second piece is implementing those security controls. So you start with that targeted risk analysis. You then implement your endpoint security, your continuous monitoring, and then Greg gave an awesome explanation of that authenticated vulnerability scanning. And then the last piece is the policies and procedures. So documenting your overall governance for each requirement, making sure your roles and responsibilities are in place, not just internally, but also externally, making sure all of your staff are cybersecurity aware, and then having those incident response playbooks in place. And if you do that, starting with, like we talked about on that first slide, looking at your overall brand formats and retail formats, you start at a high level and then you move through implementation and the policies and procedures.
I think the only thing I would add there, Ash, too, and something you hear other people have said, this new PCI 4.0.1 needs to be something that's actively engaged in throughout the entire year. It's not just a week, once a year, where you sit down with your auditor and check some boxes. These new requirements are ever evolving, and they're going to take a lot more diligence, a lot more time to get into place, put into place than what has previously been done.
And we're all here, whether it's Casey, Phil, myself, or Greg, for questions. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we want our industry to be compliant and secure, and however we can help make that happen.
Yeah, and we've got some questions here, guys. So let me go through some of these. This is a good one. I love this one. I am a branded environment. Does that mean I am PCI compliant? That's a fantastic question. This actually came up on a Conexxus meeting that Casey and I were on yesterday. So Ashwin, I want to hear your take on this.
I might get myself in trouble here. So I think every brand agreement, there's a lot of nuances depending on the brand and the type of agreement that's in place. So we know of certain brands, and I think we're supposed to say neutral here, so I won't name names, but every site, is that merchant ID under the brand, or are they individual merchant IDs? If the merchant ID is under the brand, by the letter of the law, the PCI compliance is the brand's responsibility. But if every owner and operator has their own MID, then ultimately that liability is going to largely fall on them. That being said, going back to that brand relationship and agreement, and that first slide where we kind of listed out those brand formats, I mean, is the brand acting as the payment processor? Is the brand setting the network requirements? Because generally speaking, the brands are going to do whatever they can to reduce the scope as much as possible. But I would say, and maybe somebody on this call would push back, there's no doubt that many of these branded environments are not meeting the PCI controls that are stated here, like vulnerability scanning and so on. And so I think those are things that if you are in a branded environment, it's better to reach out proactively than not.
Yep. Here's another good one. And somewhat in the same vein here. Will my POS vendor take responsibility for my system as it's closed? I think the actual question is more about if the operator doesn't have if they're not maintaining the configurations, they're not actually handling the releases. And this is the case for a large number of C-store operators. They're relying on that third party provider to provide software updates, whole OS upgrades, feature updates. Ashwin, what's the take there? Is the POS vendor on the hook there in terms of overall security controls? I think we know the answer here, but go ahead. Let's dig into that a bit.
Do you want to hit that, Greg?
Yeah, sure. I'll make some comments there and feel free to jump in too. Again, it's one of those environments where there is really no simple answer. I mean, it seems that sure, the POS vendor would be the one responsible, but ultimately, as the operator, there's some shared responsibility there. Again, when you outline that roles and responsibility matrix, at the end of the day, you are the operator. It's your environment, and you want to make sure that you're aware of it. You have those discussions with that POS vendor, making sure you stay on top of them, making sure that you hear, are regularly checking in. If there are issues they should be addressing, making sure they are addressing them.
Here's another one for you guys. Do pumps need to be scanned under 4.0.1?
That's a great question. Depending on your environment, depending on your opinion, yes and no. You can talk to different auditors. You can hear different stories. I mean, there's a lot of people say if it's an IP, it should be scanned. Other people say, well, it's connected to a hardened switch. It's basically, a relatively unintelligent terminal. It doesn't really have a true OS. It's one of those things, again, where we kind of mentioned, engaging with your auditor now before you get to audit time and getting their take on it, because ultimately they're going to be the one that interprets the standard and holds you accountable to it. So, it's kind of a gray area in a lot of areas. And I think as this continues to evolve, I think we'll get more refined on what that true stance should be.
And I would just, second what Greg said. We have spoken to auditors who have said different things around that. So if you have an auditor or you have a consultant, reach out proactively.
Yeah, for sure. Here's another good one. I think there's language to support this. How often should store managers check POI, point of interaction devices, for skimmers and other types of tamper?
I mean,
For
it's
sure.
a standard. Yeah.
Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, as a standard reads, 9.5.1, says periodical inspection, right? So defining periodic, is again kind of a vague term.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the big suggestion is determining a schedule, determining what fits for you. If that's once a shift, once a day, but make sure you have a schedule that you follow, because it's going to make it much easier than if something is found to go back in time and figure out when this happened and then how to react going forward. So I think using those types of environments and that type of interpretation, again, has to fit the industry and has to fit the business.
And I'll just add something. There's actually some ways of leveraging technology to make meeting that requirement easier. We had a merchant that basically they were not able to put these uniquely identifiable tags, strips on every single one of their pumps, which is a PCI requirement that for those point of interaction devices, you have a device inventory. But it turns out that through their MNSP platform, each of those IP connected pumps had a uniquely identifiable MAC address, and that was all centrally accessible just through their firewall. So there are some ways of meeting some of these requirements in a more automated fashion. And Phil, I think we have some other. If we click on that Q&A box at the bottom, I think we have some others here.
There's another one here. Yeah, I was just about to do that. There's another one here that just came in. Can you explain what is meant by a branded environment covered by a big brand security platform?
I think we were referring mainly to major oil brands or umbrella brands, whether it's a franchise or essentially where the operator and the overall parent brand have some sort of operator agreement. So it could be a franchise type environment or Chevron, Citgo, Exxon, so on and so forth. Speaking specifically about fuel retail.
Here's another one. For physical inspection, what are the documentation requirements for those inspections?
Well, I mean, I would say requirement 9 is going to spell it out. I mean, there's a lot of different requirements in there for physically inspecting,
Yeah.
but I don't know if there's something you want to add there, Phil, especially with firewalls. I mean, you guys have to make sure that different things are hardened and not accessible and behind lock and key and so on
Yeah,
for
yeah,
PC.
I think a lot of that is you know, physical security and having a lock on the door is how a lot of small excuse me, smaller operators handle that, right? It's putting, you know, multiple racks, and it gets complicated around physical security. You know,
One
and
thing I'd like to add too, Phil,
go
sorry
ahead.
for cutting you off. There's,
Go ahead.
making sure that, your personnel that's doing this review are trained on what to look for. That it's not just a simple, walking out and looking at the pump, and go, yeah, that looks normal. Know what is normal, know what is abnormal, and actually have an awareness of what things to check that, criminals tamper with.
Yeah, I mean the modern attacks on, like, I've seen some 3D printed, you know, overlays that are it's really physically hard to tell the difference on some of these. You know, and the attacks are pretty sophisticated. Here's another question that just came in. I love this one because I think scanning gets, you know, I think there's a lot of misinterpretation on this. This is a good question. Is there anything in the PCI requirements for authenticated scans on frequency? Would it make sense to do an authenticated scan on one frequency and then unauthenticated scans on a more frequent basis?
I'll jump in here, but Greg, you may have a different opinion on this. Personally, I think it makes sense to do it on a monthly basis. The reason being is, you're trying to get one passing scan per quarter. PCI, like Greg's slide showed, requires 4 consecutive passing quarters now. They're very clear about that. So if in month 1 you have a bunch of vulnerabilities, it may take some time to be able to initiate a rescan by month 2 to get that passing clean scan. So you really just increase your odds of having at least one passing
Yeah.
scan for that quarter by scanning on a monthly basis.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I think the other thing I'd add to that too, Ashwin, I think the frequency, you know, I think the application architecture that's shifting in C-store specifically to more modern based application delivery increases the frequency of change. So I think you're getting, you know, security updates, you're getting firmware BIOS changes, and I think to some degree, a lot of operators are unaware of that change process. And I think those changes get introduced in a very large high percentage of the time without their knowledge. And I think keeping the vulnerability scans more frequent allows you a higher degree of visibility into what's happening for sure. I definitely agree with that. Here's a good one for you guys. How should a small retailer approach their fuel brand with questions about meeting PCI requirements and current gaps of support? That's a great question.
really, I think that meeting it head on is probably the best recommendation. If it's a major fuel brand, it shouldn't be that big of a surprise to them. They should already have others in the industry asking them these questions. So I would just, recommend the approach of a head on with the major fuel brand and kind of call out what areas of concern you have and get an interactive dialogue going with them.
And once again,
Great.
that roles and responsibilities matrix. One thing I would add to that, Greg, is a lot of times the intermediary between the fuel brand and the operator may be, a fuel marketer or service contractor, so on and so forth. They may not have the answers. So, we would definitely recommend finding a way to engage with the brand directly. They do have great security teams and they do care about security and PCI compliance. We know a lot of
Absolutely.
them.
Sure. Yeah. Well, guys, I think that concludes the Q&A portion. Casey, we can hand back to you.
Yeah, sure. As soon as my camera boots back up. Well, thank you all for being here and sharing your knowledge with our audience. Just a reminder, this will be available on demand afterwards. Give us a little time to edit it, upload it. It'll be on there along with this presentation. So I know a few of you were asking about that. Once it's available on demand, it will be on our website with the presentation. So that'll all be there. Make sure you check us out next month and the month after. And thank you all for attending. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.